به نام خدا سلام. به اولین جلسه از مجموع وبینارهای تخصصی فضای سبز و منظر که به عنوان کلی درخت زندگی مطرح شده خوش آمدید. من مهدی خانسفید هستم، عضو هیئت علمی گروه مهندسی علوم باغبانی و فضای سبز پریزه کشاورزی و منابع طبیعی دانشگاه تهران. این وبینارهای تخصصی با همت و همکاری انجمن متخصصان فضای سبز و منظر ایران و گروه مهندسی علوم باغبانی و فضای سبز دانشکده علوم مهندسی کشاورزی و همچنین مساعدت معاونت پژوهش و فناوری پریزه کشاورزی و منابع طبیعی دانشگاه تهران برگزار میشه. وبینارهای درخت زندگی به صورت دوره‌ای و موضوعی برنامه‌ریزی شده. اولین مجموعه از این وبینارها با عنوان منظر کشاورزی اختصاص پیدا کرده و سخنرانانی از کشور آلمان، آمریکا، کاستاریکا، ایتالیا و ایران در آن سخنرانی میکنند. این وبینارها ضبط میشه و به صورت آنلاین بعداً انشاءالله در اختیار علاقمندان قرار میگیره. بعد از صحبت‌های من آقای مهندس پرهیزی راد، آقای مهندس آرمین پرهیزی راد، عضو هیئت مدیره و دبیر اجرایی انجمن متخصصان فضای سبز و منظر ایران، مؤسس پلتفرم درخت زندگی و و عضو کارگروه منظر کشاورزی فدراسیون بین‌المللی معماران منظر یا ایفلا به عنوان یکی از برگزار کنندگان اصلی وبینار صحبت میکنن. من همین توضیحاتی که گفتم به انگلیسی میگم، بعد در خدمت آقای مهندس پرهیزی خواهیم بود. چون یک تعداد قابل توجهی از مهمانانمون هم به حال غیر فارسی زبان هستن. Hello everyone, welcome to Tree of Life Landscape webinar series. My name is Mehdi Khansafid. I'm an assistant professor of landscape and faculty member at Department of Horticulture Science and Landscape Engineering at College of Agriculture and Natural Resources of University of Tehran. This webinar series is a joint effort co-organized by University of Tehran and the Iranian Society of Landscape Professionals, with the aim to examine the complex human natural system through the lens of landscape approach. The first theme package of Tree of Life webinars will focus on agricultural landscape, and we have very distinguished speakers from Germany, the United States, Costa Rica, Italy, and Iran during this two-day event. The webinars will be recorded and made available online. Mr. Armin Parhizi Rad will speak next as the webinar co-host and executive director of the Iranian Society of Landscape Professionals and a member of the International Federation of Landscape Architects Working Group on Agriculture and Landscape. Armin, please.
So, hello everybody. I hope you are safe and secure in this strange time of the pandemic. I'm Armin Rad, director of the Tree of Life webinar series. It is my pleasure to welcome all of you and thank you for joining us. Tree of Life is a joint effort of the Iranian Society of Landscape Professionals, ISLAP, and the University of Tehran. In parallel with the launch of Agriculture and Landscape Working Group at the International Federation of Landscape Architects, we decided to develop a platform to promote landscape approach to the agriculture. Agriculture is inherently multidimensional. It provides food and contributes to people's livelihood. It's a significant part of the economy. It's cultural, it's heritage, it's related to people's lifestyle, and it is the backbone of many societies. Finally, it is a coupled human-natural system which provides many significant environmental services. So, considering its major role in increasing the resiliency of both environment and societies, it is significant to foster an integrated approach for dealing with the agriculture. Tree of Life aims to promote such vision. Inspired by the IFLA Agriculture and Landscape Working Group, this webinar is chasing three lines: agricultural heritage, urban agriculture, and finally multifunctional agriculture. we have the privilege to host the speakers who are among top researchers of the field. I would like to thank them for accepting to participate. Again, thank all of you for joining. Let's not only design but also move towards the goal of zero hunger and access to safe, nutritious, efficient food. Thank you so much.
Well, before we continue our webinar, I just want to have a brief introduction of our first speaker. The very first part would be in Farsi version, then it would be in English. سخنران اول امروز ما آقای پروفسور فرانک لوربرگ، رئیس مؤسسه معماری منظر دانشگاه آخن هستند که درباره میراث کشاورزی شهری سخنرانی می‌کنند. دکتر فرانک لوربرگ فارغ التحصیل رشته معماری از دانشگاه هانوفر آلمان هستند. ایشون در سال 1990 جایزه خیلی مهم معماری منظر تحت عنوان پیتر جوزف لنه رو به دست آوردن و در سال 2001 موفق شدن دکترای خود رو در زمینه کشاورزی و شهرسازی از دانشگاه اشتوتگارت دریافت کنند. از سال 2010 هم به ریاست مؤسسه معماری منظر دانشگاه آخن انتخاب شدند. از جمله پروژه‌های ملی و بین‌المللی که ایشون در اون نقش داشتن میشه برنامه کشاورزی شهری اروپا اشاره کرد که در سال 2012 تا 2016 ریاست این برنامه رو به عهده داشتن. دکتر لوربرگ در سال 2019 با دریافت کمک‌های مالی از بنیاد فولکس واگن نخستین کنفرانس میراث کشاورزی شهری رو در اروپا برگزار کردند و در حال حاضر هدایت پروژه احیای نواحی صنعتی به کمک راهکارهای طبیعت محور رو بر عهده دارن. بعد از معرفی ایشون به زبان انگلیسی ازشون خواهش میکنم که سخنرانی خودشون رو ارائه بدن. Our first speaker is Professor Frank Lorberg, Chair of Institute for Landscape Architecture at RWTH Aachen University. Dr. Lorberg studied landscape architecture at Hanover University and won Peter Joseph Lene Award in 1990. Beginning in 1994, he worked at the University of Stuttgart, where he received his doctorate, which dealt with urban agriculture and city planning. Since 2002, his principal of Lorberg Stadtlandschaft Architektur, the office focuses on landscape architecture. In 2010, he was appointed as chair of Institute for Landscape Architecture at RWTH Aachen University. Professor Lorberg has chaired several national and European Union funded research projects such as Cost Action TD 1106, which is about urban agriculture Europe from 2012 to 2016. Currently, his institute coordinates the Horizon 2020 project called Pro-GIREC, focusing on revitalization of industrialized areas by nature-based solutions. He is funded by Volkswagen Foundation to conduct the first international conference on urban agriculture heritage in 2019. Today, Professor Frank Lorberg, chair of the Institute of Landscape Architecture at RWTH Aachen University, speaks about urban agriculture heritage. Frank, please.
Yeah, thank you so much for this lovely introduction. I first share my my camera and then let's share my screen. Hope that this will work. Just a second. Okay, does this work for you?
It's fine, but we still see the small window of Adobe Connect in your. Okay, that's fine.
Now it's closed and I can start.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Okay, So then, thanks again for this invitation, this lovely introduction. I was really happy to know that in Iran and at the University of Tehran, there's so much interest in landscape issues and urban agriculture issues, and that you came across my CV and my work on urban agriculture and urban agriculture as heritage. It's a privilege for me to start in these lectures, especially because I will not give a broad overview of what is going on in the lectures, but more or less focus maybe on a very specific issue, because I will talk about urban agriculture as heritage. So try to combine two discourses which have not been really linked yet, also in a global view, the one on urban agriculture and the one on cultural heritage of the cities. And so my background was already mentioned in the introduction. I made my PhD back in 2001 on a subject which at that time was more or less not on the agenda of academia. That is the role of agriculture in the cities. So, in a way, pioneered in that field, and then continued working on first with my own office, where we also had some design projects going on in the field of agriculture and urban agriculture design. And since 2010, I'm now working at Aachen as a professor, where I have the possibility to really to make research in that field. And so my first bigger project was a so-called cost action on urban agriculture Europe that took place from 2012 to 2016. And for the first time in Europe was the possibility, the opportunity to gather researchers from, I think, more than 20 European countries and to define, more or less what is urban agriculture. So I will not talk about urban agriculture in that lecture. I just have to assume that you all know a little bit about this. What I can say is that in the cost action, we came up at the end with a book and with a typology, and this is maybe all that I can say now in terms of urban agriculture, is that we are a player for seeing both scales. So the urban farming scale on the one side, which is considering professional farming activities mostly at the edge of the city, with different types of farms, leisure farms, social farms in Europe, all in Europe, maybe also cultural heritage farms and local food farms, which is quite important, especially since the Corona experience. And on the other side, a more small-scale level embedded in the city, which is urban food gardening, which we also consider as part of urban agriculture, and with different types, again, from classical allotment gardens to squatter gardens, educational gardens. So we took all this into account, and I'm very happy. We just received this summer a new funding from the European Union, and to make a new research project for 4 years, starting this November, where we can go on with this work. So there's still a big interest from the European Commission in urban agriculture, especially because the European Commission gives a lot of money to agriculture, in Europe, but has more or less neglected urban agriculture. And we think that, especially when linking both scales, the professional city edge scale with a layman volunteering small scale level in the city, that there can be a lot of innovation in that field towards transition and towards a more sustainable development. But yes, more or less at the same time, with the picture from 2012 or 13, I realized that urban agriculture has also strong roots that also have to be taken into account. And we discussed a lot about the question: is urban agriculture something that has to be newly defined? Think of new technologies like vertical farming, aquaponics, and so on. So there's a lot of interest in new technologies, and it's good so. But on the other hand, that leads to a blind eye for an agriculture which is already there in the cities, and which may have benefits for the cities, and which is destroyed because it's neglected. So I tried for the last years to treat this blind eye and to raise awareness before reinventing the wheel, before inventing new agriculture. Just in the city, have a closer look at your city. Isn't there an agriculture which has really which really can benefit the city's development? And we are here in Istanbul. This is World Heritage, but it's only the Theodosian Wall which is World Heritage. It's dating back to the 8th century, but there's also horticulture, as you can see here, really embedded in the structure of this fortification. And the horticulture is about 700 years old, but it's not really mentioned in the declaration of the UNESCO World Heritage Site. But I visited the place and was really astonished about the variety, the structure, the beauty of that urban agriculture or horticulture within, and it's nearly close to the city center for 700 years. And I visited a farmer there. He showed us what he was producing. This is, we call it portulak, so a kind of salad, which he sells in a family business with his father, and on a short way, using a car to the restaurants. So this is so he's part of, we would say today, he's part of an interesting food system with less food miles, fresh vegetables out of the regions, and so on. So we can appreciate what he's doing here. So this is again the fields of this farmer. You see him in the background with his family, but you also see that the grove where his house is, in behind the trees, that there are housing areas, gated communities now grabbing for the land. And it just took 6 weeks after I left the place that it was destroyed. So this is only a web picture, but bulldozers came up and they destroyed the place because no one at that time had seen the beauty and the functional benefits of this area. So dramatic scenes at that time, and astonishing for me as the landscape architect is they destroyed it not for housing but to build a new park. And that really questioned also my self-understanding of what landscape architecture has to do in the city, because I would love to build such a park. Okay, it's not my favorite design, but I would love to do parks in the city. But is it reasonable to destroy a 700 years old agricultural landscape within the city, which is closely bound to the city walls, and to replace it by kind of instant landscape architecture, which could be everywhere in the city, and maybe it could be in Tehran or in New York as well, or in a Chinese city. So that really challenged my understanding of landscape architecture. But I think it was for the first time in the world, maybe in the world, that local people stood up and they started to fight. They not for the new park, but for the old agricultural heritage system. So that was really astonishing me, that there were local people, grassroots, that demonstrated against the deconstruction, and they rebuilt the typical planting seed beds, which you can see here in the foreground. So I never heard from such activities before. They restored it. They did some workshops there with children, really on this devastated area of land, to raise the issue for the Bostons. So that's the way these gardens are named in Istanbul. So a sad story, but it's not really ended. So at the moment, the city of Istanbul is also thinking of restoring agriculture again, but this is more or less 8 years after it has been destroyed because of neglection. Another place, another story, same setting, which is World Heritage again, and urban horticulture. But I think with this other example from Bamberg in Germany, I can show you that there are opportunities to go on with these traditional forms of agriculture. Bamberg is, part of Bavaria, south of Germany. On the right side, you can see the structure of the city, which is containing three parts. City on the hill, Bergstadt on the left, in the middle, the city on an island between two parts of a river, and on the right side above, the so-called Gärtnerstadt, which means garden cities, and they are all part of a world heritage. And this garden cities is quite an interesting structure, because I think for 400 years or 450 years, a small-scale urban streets or settlement has established in Bamberg, and it also contained backyards, professional horticulture. You can see it here on old maps from 1642 or even from the 16th century, where you can see urban streets with houses and backyards. You can see professional agriculture. And believe it or not, this agriculture, horticulture is still alive today. There are still professionals working here. So it's also part of the World UNESCO Cultural Heritage, but it took another way than in Istanbul. So you can see here the professional gardening in Bamberg. This is a map showing again the structure with these urban street, house next to each other, and backyards. You can see a green area, which is a horticultural area, but due to some reasons, first fields have fallen fallow, has been turned to recreational areas. So it's a fragile, it's a contested heritage. And so this is a picture you can see. So horticulture and greenhouses, but you also can see here that parts of the land lying idle. So, but the city of Bamberg felt responsible for this kind of heritage, despite other than in Istanbul, and they took several measures to go on with this urban agricultural heritage, which is raising public awareness, giving better public access, so no one really can see what is going on backyards because houses are next to each other. So giving better public access is a mean to really enhance the mental map of the city. And third, and also interesting pathway is promoting gardeners' traditional products. So some images or explanations on that. Rising public awareness. The city built kind of a scenic trail with some here in this area again with a museum which allows to go backyards and an outlook tower which also allows people to look in the area and see what's going on there and also explain the history of all this. So this is houses back from the 18th century, I think, and today there's a museum in and showing on how generations of farmers have worked and lived there. And also there's a museum garden backyard showing the plants that have been cultivated there, special sort of onions, seeds that were sold all over Europe. So quite at that time also more or less globalized agriculture, but within the city here, the onions, so-called Bamberger onions, tools, and this is also part of the intangible heritage. Gardeners are part of the yearly processions in June with their own means and objects. And this is the lookout tower where, everybody can really have a look at the area, and this raises the awareness of the agriculture in the city. And gardeners are also promoted in terms of products. They are allowed to sell directly, and the city is also launching new products, helps them. This is, for example, called Bamberg Süßholz. Süßholz means licorice, so this is a root from a plant which was used in the medieval times to sugar before sugar beet was invented. So they tried to find old plants in the area and were successful, and now there's a new line of production of this traditional licorice. So two similar settings, but two different ways, and that was again for me the motivation to ask in Germany the Volkswagen Foundation to get a funding for a conference to bring together researchers from all over the world to raise awareness for urban agriculture as heritage, and I was successful. I convinced the jury, got 100,000 euros, and then was able to make this conference, which took place last year. And I also met Parvez Kohafkan from Iran there. He's very, really professional guy working in the field of agriculture as heritage, and we really shared our experience, and he enriched the conference very much. It's a very prestige setting, maybe too prestige for urban agriculture, but anyway, a lot of people there, also young people there, and we also made a website, and it's still available for you. You can go there, especially on the showcases. We have a lot of showcases, and you can see some videos, and I don't know if it works, but one video will be shown now.
The Octilonage of Amion are a large group of gardens surrounded by canals. They are situated in France, 150 kilometers north of Paris. The emergence of these gardens was enabled through the river Somme, which meets the river Louvre 3 kilometers east of Amiens. La Somme created a marshy valley which existed until the 16th century. That's why, in 1542, the locals started agriculture in this area. To turn the wetlands into a ground suitable for agriculture, they built a network of canals which created a large allotment of islands. On these islands, they produced vegetables and fruits for hundreds of years. However, since the beginning of the 20th century, agriculture declined in the area due to the development of refrigerated transport. The gardeners' population has decreased over the years. In 1900, there were 950 gardeners in the area, and today there are only 7. The Octilonage gradually became a recreation area for the city inhabitants and an area of touristic activities. 120,000 tourists visit the area each year. The touristic character of the area stimulated the production of flowers in the gardens. The area of the Octilonage consists of 3 elements. The wider public canals are called rieux. The narrow canals are called fossés. These private canals are the only way to reach the gardens. The islands themselves are called aires. These are divided into multiple parcels. These islands provide a unique character to the landscape. Today, a few of them are used as vegetable gardens, orchards, and weekend gardens. A large number of them have turned into wilderness. The crops which are produced in the Octilonage include salads, radishes, carrots, onions, cabbages, potatoes, and artichokes. In the past, the produced crops were sold at a floating market. Gardener families transported their goods using boats. Nowadays, the market takes place once a year in memory of an old tradition.
But I will come to the end of my lecture. But I thought it might be interesting to show what my students have done, because they spend a lot of energy really in detecting more and more cases of urban agriculture heritage, and we are just at the beginning of research in that field. And if so, I would also encourage the audience, if you think there are more of these cases, please give me a hint. And in Herrenhausen at the conference, we tried to bring together different perspectives from different disciplines, not only urban agriculture, but also invited historians to talk about town history, invited stakeholders from cultural heritage or from urbanism field, and really to bring together these perspectives. And just to come to an end, outcomes are of this conference, there is a high interest meanwhile, and there were valuable contributions, and also a next generation was at start at that time. And so there's first community in the field of urban agriculture heritage, which I would like to grow and to sustain in the future. So we had really outstanding cases presented, like in my presentation, Istanbul, Bamberg, for example, which shows the opportunities, and that there are also some first instruments to address urban agriculture as heritage. Parviz Gohafkan, for example, he introduced us to the globally important agricultural heritage systems, the GIS, which somehow based also in an Iranian context with this saffron heritage system, which are covered by the GIS, and beautiful agricultural landscapes in the city, in the world, but only a few really touching or urban settings, like here in the Maghreb. Some Chinese examples from Chinese cities. This is near Beijing, the royal rice fields, which are also covered by this instrument. So there are first instruments, and we have to work on in that field to bring more urban agricultural heritage under the umbrella of this globally important heritage systems. And the conference also made clear specific benefits when approaching urban agriculture, better footing of urban agriculture, counterbalancing of technology-focused development, and somehow enlarging the repository of knowledge of urban agriculture. And just to go quickly through this, I think better footing, the challenge is that urban agriculture is widespread. Everybody knows what urban agriculture is, but in many parts of the city, it is still not seen as an integral part of the city. Yeah, it's treated more as a rural leftover. Oh, look, so beautiful. And I think looking at urban agriculture heritage makes clear that urban agriculture is really not outdated or contradictory to the cities, or something that really follows the city, is embedded in the city more or less since we know about the first cities. So heritage can help us to turn the perception from old, outdated to something valuable and worthy. This better footing and counterbalancing, especially dedicated to all these vertical farming, new technology initiatives, is okay. You can go like this, but also have a view on what is really going on and make research on existing forms of urban agriculture. Don't neglect them. This is, I think, the other benefit in that direction. And we have to go on and find more and more outstanding cases. This is from Japan, Tokyo. We had Professor Yokohari with us, and he showed that these parcels of land, which are really in the suburbs of Tokyo and have a tradition of 300 years of agricultural use. And last issue is enlarging the repository of knowledge on urban agriculture and the set of tools for adaptation. I think urban agriculture can also help us when talking about global challenges and cities that have to be redirected towards circular, decarbonized, and regionalized economies. So we are thinking of how, especially after Corona, how to regionalize our cities. And if we look at urban agriculture, I think we can see a lot of lessons learned from urban agriculture's heritage that we can still use today. This is urban agriculture heritage presented by Paige Rexel from some African cities, and you can see on the right side what we do today with sewage. But there are examples, especially in history, where nutrients have been reused by urban agriculture. We can learn a lot looking at these examples, or also from African cities, old species, indigenous vegetables, which have been examined by Margaret Paschini, and she talked in our conference of that experience, that especially in the cities, there's the richness, a big agro biodiversity, which also has to be kept, and urban agriculture's heritage can contribute to this. So, this was my lecture about my coming across urban agriculture's heritage, where I want to go next. I had the opportunity to present it on several conferences, so was very happy also to be invited here to go on with this. And we will make a publication out of the book, first book on urban agriculture's heritage. And also the VW Foundation will go on with this. They launched a call Global Issues, integrating different perspectives on cultural heritage and change. So I think also working at the mindset when treating heritage or when treating urban agriculture is really a big issue. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much for your great presentation. خیلی ممنون از ارائه خوبی که داشتین. من فقط درخواستی که دارم اگر دوستان سوالشون رو یادداشت بکنن همینجا، یا اگر علاقه‌مند هستن دستشون رو بالا ببرن، میکروفونشون رو فعال بکنیم که سوال خودشون رو بپرسن. If there are any questions, it would be nice you just write down your question. If you want to ask it orally, please raise your hand. I will activate your microphone and you can talk. I think one of my colleagues has a question. Dr. Khalil Najat from University of Birjand wants to ask a question. Dr. Khalil Najat, بفرمایید سوالتون.
Hello to everyone. Thank you very much of Professor Frank Lorberg. Firstly, I want to be thankful very much from Professor Frank Lorberg because in 2010 or 2011, he enlightened me the first glance of research, and for his appreciable guidance helped me in the time of writing the first draft of my PhD proposal. Unfortunately, it was not possible for me to work under the supervision of Professor Lorberg because my financial supporter pushed me to another university in Germany. But based on the guidance of Professor Lorberg, I worked on Persian garden urban agricultural heritage for the first time. It was very interesting for me to be in this webinar because I know some of these experience of Professor Lorberg via the books or online websites. Yes, I investigated the role of Persian garden in envisioning the urban agriculture in Iran for the first time, and I'm very thankful of Professor Lorberg for this proposal. My question is, from the industrial ecology, Persian garden would be a starting point for urban agriculture revitalization in Iran, but it is the first research in this regard. I need to continue this research much deeper. My question is, from the cultural ecology, how we can search on a Persian garden for revitalization, the agricultural landscape, how we can revitalize the agricultural landscape of Persian garden under the umbrella of urban agriculture. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, if I should answer, I mean, you are the expert, as you have really made your PhD in this field, and you know the Persian gardens very much better than me, and how they might have influenced agriculture over the years and centuries. So I'm not an expert in this field, but I know from Germany that the classical gardens, especially in the Baroque area, they also have been places of agricultural inventions innovations. So new plants, also in the romantic area, new plants have been first shown in these classical aristocratic gardens, and new techniques have been shown there. So this might be a link. But I also would encourage you to leave the garden, to leave the classical Persian garden, and go outside in the city and look what agriculture or food, how it has shaped the cities, and if there are still structures. And I know that the Persian case is a specific one because of the irrigation systems, which really link the garden, the park, the city very much. But I think to detect urban agriculture as part of the history of towns might be very, very interesting. And I know that there are, some of the oldest cities of the world are in your area, so it might be very interesting to find out how they have evolved through the time with which forms of agriculture.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor. Hope the best for you and your colleagues in Aachen.
Thank you very much.
There's one option orally.
Hello, can you hear me?
بفرمایید.
Hello, thank you for your amazing lecture. It was very useful for me. I have a question. Maybe it looks a bit silly, but I couldn't convince myself. As you said, we have different types of urban agriculture. From gardening in balcony or on top of rooftops to urban farms. My question is about urban farms because they are much bigger, so they are more productive. But as you know, urban lands are too expensive for poor or even medium people. So these people must work for rich peoples or communities. But in developing countries, we don't have enough community, and also existing community don't have enough power, and most of them are under control of government. So one of the goals of urban agriculture is decrease poverty. But in this context, I think it can increase it. So maybe it looks like feudalism. So in your opinion, how we can manage this problem? Thank you.
Okay, I don't know if I got you, but I think you were talking about developing countries, cities in developing countries, their specific situation, and which role urban agriculture can play there. And I think if you go at the FAO, the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, they have meanwhile clearly committed to urban agriculture, which is really a big step forward, because for years and years they were more or less promoting a modern industrialized agriculture. But the FAO, they clearly have seen the advantages of an urban agriculture in the city. And for example, they promote micro gardens also for bigger cities where people with less income can have at least an additional income, especially women, by making urban agriculture. So you are right, it is really depending on the context. In a industrialized, maybe northern, western city, urban agriculture is often more for education and leisure and cultural things. But really in cities, in these developing countries, they can really, agriculture can really be part of the income structure, and it also can help greening the cities. I mean, the cities don't have much money for traditional greening, and we are talking about green infrastructure as the infrastructure that we need in the next decades to cope with climate change and so on. So if the city doesn't have money to build parks like the Istanbul wanted to do, why not just taking what is there, the agriculture, which greens the city also, and where farmers maintain the landscape, and also other cultural issues, values with them. So I think all over the world, urban agriculture is makes sense, reasonable, but you're right. We have to really have a close look at the context and the role of urban agriculture.
Thank you very much. I can see Professor Behbahani, which is one of our very loved professors among the participants. خانم دکتر بهبهانی خیلی خوش آمد میگم به شما، خیلی لطف کردین که تشریف آوردین. اگر سوالی دارین میکروفونتون فعال هست، اگر موضوعی هست بفرمایید ما در خدمت شما باشیم استفاده بکنیم از حضور شما. آقای مهندس پرویزی میخواین دو تا از سوالای که نوشته شده رو بخونین. Some of the questions that are written here, probably you should have a look at them and see if you can find a proper answer for that as well.
Yeah, how can we get more information about recent projects on urban agriculture? I mean, maybe it's too much information in the web about urban agriculture. So you can find a lot. Also, I would recommend for urban agriculture, I would recommend the RUAF Foundation, which has done a lot all over the world. And I would really recommend what FAO is doing. They are currently really working hard in terms of reacting, how can food systems and urban agriculture can react to coronavirus. So they are very up to date. And in terms of urban agriculture's heritage, so there are no publications available yet. So we are making a book. Hopefully it's published next year or the year after. So this will be the first one. Again, have a look at the website Urban Agriculture minus Heritage. Then you can see some case studies. We are still at the phase of collating stuff of cases, and the next step would be really then more conceptualizing, more structuring it, but it's a longer research that we have to do. Other questions? Yeah, thank you, Dr. Kalinizat, for pointing this out. And I think this is the cost action urban agriculture side. And then there was another question: what works best, community-led urban agriculture or government-led through policy and laws? Wow, that's the really crucial question. I think we have to combine it. I mean, it's wonderful that there are many communities, bottom-up, grassroots, coping or conducting agriculture, but they need frameworks really, because if you invest in agriculture, it's not a project for 1 year. You have to make it for 5 years, for 10 years, in terms of irrigation for 20 years, for 30 years, facilities and so on. So you need stable and constant conditions, and this is something policies and laws come into play We have found evidence for this when examining cases in Europe, and in Western Europe, a lot of new urban agriculture projects came up, but in Eastern Europe, not, because Eastern Europe shifted dramatically in the last 20 years from a socialist to a capitalist system. So everything was unclear. No one invested in agriculture. There were no laws, no governance in that field, and that really hindered the involvement of these community-led urban agriculture. So combination of both.
Thank you very much. I thank you very much for your great presentation, and I thank all the attendees for their great engagement and questions. Of course, there are many more questions to be answered about urban pollutions and things like that, but we have to move on to our next speaker.
Everybody can send me an email if there are further questions, or if there are hints for interesting projects all over the world, and we can work on by email. So thank you very much again for this invitation and the opportunity to present urban agriculture's heritage.
Thanks so much, and we say goodbye to you. Thanks again.
Bye.
Bye. من همینجا باز تشکر میکنم از اساتیدی هم که از دانشگاه مختلف تو جمع ما هستن. من آقای دکتر جانیپور رو دیدم، بهشون خوش آمد میگم. آقای دکتر خلیل نژاد، خانم دکتر بهبهانی خیلی لطف کردن. اگر اساتید دیگه ای هم وجود هستن، آقای مهندس گلچین رو دیدم، اساتید دیگه هم هستن، به طور خاص بهشون خوش آمد میگیم. خوشبختانه ما الان سر وقت هستیم و میتونیم وارد بخش دوم، در واقع ارائه دوم بشیم. اگر لطف بکنین خانوم پروفسور لاول رو به عنوان پرزنتر اضافه بکنین، چون من دیدم حضور داشتن. بعد من یک اینترو کوچیکی ازشون بگم، یه معرفی کوتاهی ازشون به زبان فارسی و انگلیسی داشته باشم و بعد ازشون خواهش بکنیم اسلایداشون رو نمایش بدن. خوشبختانه زمان بندیمون خوبه، دقیقاً ساعت 6 تونستیم به سخنرانی دوم برسیم. Thank you very much. Now we move to the second presentation. At the very beginning, I give a brief introduction in Farsi and English about Professor Lovell, and then we would ask her to have her presentation. Sarah, very welcome, and just a few minutes for introduction, and then we're going to ask you to share your screen. سخنران دوم امروزمون خانم پروفسور سارا لاول هستند، مدیر مرکز اگروفارستری دانشگاه میزوری که درباره اگرواکولوژی و طراحی منظرهای چند منظوره سخنرانی میکنند. دکتر سارا لاول دارای کرسی استادی دانشگاه میزوری آمریکا هستند و مدیریت مرکز اگروفارستری این دانشگاه رو بر عهده دارند. همچنین سابقه تدریس در دانشگاه ایلینوی و ورمانت رو نیز در سابقه خودشون دارند. مدرک کارشناسی ارشد و دکترای کشاورزی و همچنین مدرک کارشناسی ارشد معماری منظر خودشون رو از دانشگاه ایلینوی دریافت کردن و به شکل تخصصی در زمینه تجزیه و تحلیل طراحی منظرهای چند منظوره فعالیت میکنن. از میان پژوهش‌های ارزنده ایشون موضوعاتی مانند برنامه‌ریزی جامع مزارع کشاورزی شهری و اگروفارستری به چشم میخوره. ایشون تالیفات پژوهشی میاندانشی خودشون رو در موضوعات تاب‌آوری نظام‌های تولید غذا از طریق رویکرد منظر انجام دادن و همچنین من بعد از در واقع معرفیشون به زبان انگلیسی ازشون خواهش میکنم که ارائه خودشون رو انجام بدن. Our second speaker, Professor Sarah Lovell, is Director of the Center for Agroforestry at University of Missouri. Dr. Lovell serves as H.A. Garrett Endowed Chair, Professor and Director of the Center for Agroforestry at University of Missouri. This appointment follows 10 years she served on the faculty at the University of Illinois and the previous 3 years on the faculty at University of Vermont. Her research philosophy has evolved from an interdisciplinary background, including Master of Science and PhD in Agronomy, followed by Master of Landscape Architecture from University of Illinois. With a focus on the analysis and design of multifunctional landscape, Dr. Lovell's research program has emphasized whole farm planning, productive agroforestry, and urban agriculture. She has published widely in multidisciplinary journals. Dr. Lovell is committed to improving the resiliency of our food system through landscapes that supply nutrient-dense and healthy products. Today, Professor Lovell will talk about agroforestry as a guiding framework for designing multifunctional landscape. Sarah, hello again, and the stage is yours.
Hello. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, great.
Okay, excellent. I have my headset on today, so hopefully this will work better. Let me pull up my presentation. Okay, are you seeing that okay? Okay, excellent. Well, first of all, thank you very much for this invitation. It's really an honor to be joining this international group from here in the United States. I guess it's afternoon for you, or evening probably, and early morning here. So I'll go ahead and get into my topic for today. It was interesting hearing a little bit from the previous speaker about urban agriculture. I've done some work in that area as well, but today I'm going to talk a little bit more about the broad agricultural landscape, that rural area. And we see, like, looking at this group that's a lot of, I think, landscape architects and landscape designers and planners. Rarely do we engage with these agricultural landscapes. And
Sarah,
many times these agricultural
may I interrupt you for
yes.
a second? There's a small
Yes.
window in the right side of your screen. Please minimize that so that we can see your full screen. Thank you very much.
There you go. Okay, yep, great. Thank you for catching that. So these agricultural landscapes, what we find is that they're rarely designed at the same level of intention, with the same level of detail and thought that we deal with urban spaces. Most of our landscape architects work on more of these urban areas. And we ask this, why is this the case when so much land is agricultural land and in need of thoughtful planning? Well, one thing, of course, is it's very profit driven. So there's that kind of one driver that's very production oriented. Another thing that we see really strongly here in the U.S. is that there are just lack of consequences for the issues created. So when we see erosion and other issues, many times the landowners just aren't regulated in any way. So that can become a problem. And then the final thing is that in most cases, these parcels of land are owned by different individuals. So it's really that one individual who's making the land management decision instead of a larger, broader framework of planning. So what do we do? Because we really want to think on a broader scale, and if we want to address some of the bigger issues related to climate resilience, we really need to think about these things from a planning level, and we need to engage landscape architects in these landscapes. So I'm going to talk about a few things. I'm going to talk about a couple of frameworks, agroecology and landscape multifunctionality, that can be applied when we think about designing these agroecosystems. I'm going to talk about a design process as well, so the multiple different stages of this design process, and I'm going to use a research farm, the University of Illinois research farm as kind of a case study to show how this design process works. Then I'm going to talk about some more recent applications, really looking at agroforestry and a productive level of agroforestry that might serve as a different kind of solution, a more transformative solution to our agricultural and food system overall. And then I'm going to really think about the human component by looking at our future directions and thinking about human health. So let's first talk about what agroecology is. And this is a field that really developed as a response to the Green Revolution. So it offered an alternative to that very industrial, high input type of agriculture, and really thinking about different options and recognizing that there were these downsides to the industrialized agriculture. We see in agroecology that they typically use ecological principles when they're looking at the design and or the management of agricultural systems. Most often we see more emphasis on the management of the system over thinking about a complete redesign of the system. So it's very management oriented, like thinking about managing nutrients. And then we also see when we do look at the design aspects, they typically draw from two different sources of knowledge. One is using the natural ecosystems as a model and trying to mimic those natural ecosystems in how we structure our plant systems, even the agricultural ones. And then also it's kind of going back to the traditional knowledge, the pre-industrial agroecosystems, and recognizing that we can learn from some of these very traditional practices. In the U.S., the Native American history on the landscape can tell us a lot about how we might think about our food systems and design systems. So the other framework I want to bring up, and this is really one that guides a lot of my research, is the idea of landscape multifunctionality. And I use this concept as kind of an alternative to talking about sustainable systems, but it really is about sustainability of the design of agroecosystems. So with landscape multifunctionality, we're really wanting to integrate not just the production functions, but also bringing in the ecological and cultural functions. And the concept has been applied a lot in European countries. We see a greater, I guess, appreciation for the cultural aspects in particular when we compare it to the US anyway. So it's really thinking about stacking cultural functions, ecological functions, and production functions. And if we bring all these together, we achieve this higher level of landscape performance overall. The other part that I'd like to emphasize is that we really have to think about the site-specific context, which means it's going to be very different if we're thinking about an agricultural landscape that's in a rural area where it's just surrounded by other agricultural landscapes versus something that you're doing in an urban area like you were talking about earlier. And then we also need to think about those needs and the preferences of the users. And so in an urban environment, you have a lot of different users who are engaging with that space. In the rural areas, the main user is really that landowner and just kind of the surrounding landowners in that area. So it's not unlike the idea of sustainability. You have kind of the same dimensions. The ecological functions are similar to environmental. Production functions are the economic aspect, and cultural functions are the social aspect. But what I've found, particularly when we're talking about designing systems, is that when I talk to, like when I'm teaching a class and I talk to students about designing a sustainable landscape, it's a kind of nebulous term for them. And they're trying to get at, the perfect integration of those three dimensions, but it's not very specific. So it's easier to talk about just let's start adding on these different functions. What are the functions that we know we need to attain in the landscape? And the production function piece really still needs to be in there, obviously, with an agricultural landscape. That's what we basically define agricultural landscapes as. Okay, so let's just talk about some of these functions. With production, we might be producing fresh food or food for processing, but it could include things like medicinal products or firewood, feed that's used for livestock, fiber like cotton. If we're talking about ecological functions, that's more like the biodiversity conservation, nutrient cycling, microclimate control, water quality, the things that we talk about for a lot of spaces. And then the cultural functions are, this is the piece that in the United States we really miss out on in the agricultural landscapes, is the opportunity to integrate things like recreation, thinking about what that visual quality of the landscape is, artistic expression, research, looking at the cultural heritage of a site. So integrating across all of those to think about this higher level of performance. If we think about these two frameworks, we have agroecology and the multifunctionality framework. With agroecology, it's focused on that ecological science. It's connected a lot with simple agronomy. It talks about farmer livelihoods and farmer knowledge. One thing that's really different is the scale it works at. So oftentimes with agroecology, they're talking about things at just the field scale and maybe up to the farm scale, but really most often the field scale. And they're emphasizing those management practices. On the other hand, with multifunctionality, we're bringing in those ecosystem services or these different functions that I'm talking about. We're thinking broader about rural communities overall in that landscape ecology field. And here we're talking about a scale that really goes from the farm scale up to the landscape or even the region. So some of the applications we see here are about like the planning aspect and different cultural features. If we integrate these two together, I have a lot of pieces on here, but I'm going to emphasize these last couple of where we bring these together. What we really gain is this integration of the contemporary scientific knowledge, but also thinking about local knowledge and what's understood in that region and the traditional, more historic knowledge, bringing those pieces together to try to come up with the best solution, and then assimilating the natural and social sciences together. Okay, so what I'm talking about with those frameworks, I covered a lot in this paper of integrating agroecology and landscape multifunctionality. There's also a part in there that talks about landscape assessment, and there's a landscape analysis tool, a multifunctional landscape analysis tool that are some of the elements you see on the upper right-hand side there, where it's looking at these different multiple functions and putting numeric values on those so that you could make a decision between different solutions, alternative solutions. Next, I'm going to talk about the landscape design process that is material that comes from this paper, Creating Multifunctional Landscapes. I'm going to use the example of the University of Illinois Field Research Station. And this is one of the big agricultural experimental stations that many of the land-grant universities in the United States have. Oftentimes there's a large area of land dedicated to research to meet the needs of the communities that they serve. And to give you some context here, and basically what we are talking about is this first step in the design process, which is designing the project site and looking at the landscape context. This field research station is somewhat unique in that it's located so close to the college campus. It's basically a continuum from the college campus to where the research center is located. In most cases, at a lot of universities, like where I'm at now at University of Missouri, all of the research farms are located in outer areas, more in rural areas. So this one actually abuts the urban area of Champaign-Urbana. The darker purple area you can see is where the main campus is located. The lighter pink shows the municipal area. And then that whole area that's green that you see is dedicated to the research center. And then there's that transition zone that I show that used to be where the farm was located, the research center, but that's being overtaken by the campus and particularly like recreational facilities. So you see this tension, I guess, between what's going on in the research center and that it's this high value land and that it connects right up with the university and with the residential areas. So it's important to understand that context and really understand the positive and negative externalities from that. The next step then would be characterizing and analyzing what these existing features are and how these function. So we want to be able to represent the different biophysical features on the site, whether it's hydrology or land use, overall vegetation. We want to understand the soil types, even the built infrastructure that exists on the site. So it's a lot of like mapping out these pieces, conducting analysis. Also want to represent the socioeconomic features and conditions of the site, wanting to think about what the population density is, what the household incomes are. Land values are very important in this area. This is very high value land because it competes with other development uses. And then we can actually develop models to predict the types of changes. And on the right, I show, this is just an example of one of the models using a digital elevation model to show the topography of the site, which is, if you saw the site, it's actually very flat. But so the topography is subtle, but highlighted here to be able to show what's actually going on in relation to the hydrology. So this is a hydrologic model that shows the drainage lines and the catchments, and then understanding how the flow, overland flow occurs, and then ultimately creating a map to consider monitoring on the site. So the next step when we really begin to understand the site well is to start working on the master plan and understanding how to develop this. And we proposed using this ecosystem approach, which by the name you would guess that it emphasizes ecosystem processes. One part that's really important about the ecosystem approach is that it does recognize humans as part of the system. It doesn't see them as just the separate entity that's modifying the landscape. It's our organisms within the system. So we really need to think about how we contribute to the change in the landscape. And we can even think about it in terms of our own health. Us as humans, how, are we healthy? And are we kind of an indicator species of what's going on in that landscape? This approach also looks at integrating these multiple functions. There's an encouragement to increase the heterogeneity of the landscape, so having a lot of different land use types and biodiversity on the landscape, water quality and managing the quantity of water on a site would be another important aspect. For this particular project, we looked at 3 different alternatives to kind of push the edges on each one of these dimensions. So on the left, it's a very production-oriented design. It's looking at just the land use as a research farm and as agricultural uses. In the center one, it's more ecologically oriented. And on the right-hand side, it's one that's oriented more toward the cultural functions, toward the human experience in that landscape. And then ultimately coming up with an alternative that tries to bring the best of these pieces together. So thinking about, we need to have that agricultural component. We certainly need to have, it is a research farm, so we need to be looking at research on field crops and on pasture lands. But we can also integrate these ecological features like forests and buffer areas, the prairie that would have been native to this area, integrating that, and then also understanding that connection with people. So the next stage is to drill in a little bit closer into certain parts of the site and develop individual site designs that help to reveal that ecological function. And this is something we might refer to as eco-revelatory design, the idea that we're going to highlight the ecological functions so that users of the site can better understand how that site is working. So if you look in the upper right, you can, that's kind of an index map, and that green box shows the area that I'm highlighting in this larger design piece. So it's one portion of the site that connects with both the university campus and the residential community. So it's a great place to have a research and education center. They have an observatory to kind of look over that whole landscape, and then a lot of engagement overall. So in this aspect, in this part of the process, we're looking at using sustainable and local building materials, wanting to protect and treat water on the site, conserving biodiversity, recognizing that agriculture is what the site is all about, and so producing that food and energy, but thinking about how those might be used locally. And in this part of the site, really encouraging the research and public education and really engaging people with the site, even though there might be other parts of the entire farm that you might not want to have public access to. So this shows a more detailed plan of what that looks like. On the left, you can see where the tree orchard area is, and that's more research oriented. The smaller cells are showing different demonstration systems, looking at different types of agriculture and transecting through those areas to see how those are designed and connecting up with the forested area. But again, the idea is just, finding those site designs and highlighting the functions of those. And then finally, this is a step that's often overlooked and really needs to be considered from the very beginning of the design process, is the idea of monitoring the ecological functions over time, even after the design is installed and completed. But it's important to think about this early on because you can create that infrastructure that's necessary to be able to do this. So you're wanting to be able to come up with quantifiable evidence of how the landscape is functioning, understanding that overall performance to see if it's a successful type of approach, to see if the things that we're doing are actually more sustainable than what's been done previously. We want to be able to integrate that infrastructure, have these landscape features that allow for experimentation, including the replication of different types of systems. And we really want to involve agroecologists and ecologists through this process to understand what are the indicators that we want to look at and what are the variables. And on the right, this comes from that hydrologic model that I showed you earlier. This is an example of thinking about this idea of monitoring early on. And from that hydrologic model, we were able to identify 6 of these small little sub-watersheds that were similar sizes. They were around 30 acres. And the point at which those were draining to a single area where you might monitor those areas that are under different types of land use to compare what the water quality is coming off of those. So how does it differ looking at an annual cropping system versus a pasture-based system that has livestock integrated? So this is just an example of, by doing this early on, we could put the infrastructure into the site. Okay, so from all of this that I've been talking about at the landscape scale, we haven't totally dug into the fact that our agricultural systems are generally not sustainable. So overlooked even in agroecology itself is this opportunity for real transformation of the landscape from just a strong emphasis on annual cropping systems to thinking about more perennial cropping systems. So,
Sarah,
like
may
in
I
Iran,
interrupt you?
yes, yep.
Could you please turn on your camera, because some of the attendees are really interested to see your picture at the time that you are presenting.
Okay, let me see how I do this.
Sorry for interruption.
Yeah, no problem. I had it on at one time, but I'm not sure how I did that. Let's see.
That's great.
So you can
We
see
can
me.
see your video right
So
now. Yes.
do you
Just
see
go back to
the
full
slide
screen mode.
presentation? Okay.
Not in
Okay.
full screen mode. That's fine. Just minimize this small window and it would be fine.
Okay, hold on. Okay, how's that?
That's great. Thank you very much. Sorry for interruption.
Okay, no problem at all. So, like in Iran, much of the most productive agricultural land in the Midwest is annual cropping systems. In Iran, it's wheat and barley. In the Midwest part of the United States, we have a corn and soybean rotation. But in these systems, we're tilling the land. There are parts of when the land is often uncovered, and so you have problems with erosion. You're missing opportunities for sequestering carbon in the soil, and generally just a system where a lot of inputs are going into the system and you're outputting a product that may not always contribute highly to a good human health system. So we're proposing that agroforestry has something to offer here. And agroforestry, basically the definition is integrating trees and shrubs with crops or livestock. And it can be and or livestock. There are 5 main practices that we talk about in temperate zones. One's alley cropping, where we have rows of trees with a companion crop in alleyways. So it would be like planting trees even amongst in a field of wheat. So the trees might be planted, like 10 to 20 meters apart, and between those rows you could still grow an annual cropping. Forest farming is designed for naturally forested. This is the idea of growing high-value crops that are shade tolerant in the understory of the managed forest. Repairing buffer things that protect streams and lakes, improve water quality. Pasture brings in the livestock component. So livestock are known to be great nutrient cyclers. So they can consume areas and provide manure that helps with nutrient cycling. And then windbreaks are rows of trees and shrubs that protect, it could be soils or crops or livestock from the wind, and they can also offer irrigation. These are some examples here. You see a black walnut combination with spring oats. You can see a coppiced hazelnut, vegetables grown in the center. And upper right is the riparian forest buffer. And then various other systems. You can see a couple that cattle in a silvopasture system. Those with the cattle, the trees would be mainly designed for timber products. We also see applications for agroforestry in urban areas as well. And so we've added the 6th practice, the urban food forest, which is bringing in a wide range of perennial food-producing plants and really looking at how we improve the sustainability and resilience of urban communities, but also a really great opportunity for engagement and education with urban areas, with urban communities. And oftentimes what we'll see is a very diverse, mixed structure that you can see here with tall trees and shrubs, so different layers. And the images that you see along the bottom are all came from one single food forest on a small, like just a 1 hectare lot in an urban area. So very diverse. Again, at this type of scale, it may not produce a huge amount of food that makes a large dent in the food needs for that community, but it certainly offers something for the educational perspective and different diets. Scale, but the same type of multi-system is called production agroforestry. With a lot of the agroforestry practices, they are seen more as supportive practices, like the riparian buffers are trees and shrubs that are designed to protect the water. Windbreaks might be protecting the crop, but we oftentimes don't see the potential or have ignored the potential for the trees and shrubs themselves to be productive and contribute to the food system. So in this concept, we're really emphasizing the woody specialty crops and particularly thinking about fruits and nuts that can be provided. On the left, you see I'm showing you some products that are native to our region. The pecan, northern pecan is the upper one, a pawpaw, which is the largest fruit native to the U.S., and then some aronia berries, which are also native. And so these cover different layers, like the pecan is going to be the large canopy tree. A pawpaw can grow as an understory tree in dappled light in the shade environment. And then aronia can be a shrub that grows in between the trees. And so you can see a system that's set up even on a large scale for commercial production. So we asked this question of, can this productive agroforestry concept, could it actually replace some of the agriculture that's in these temperate regions like the Midwest US. So for our region, what we're thinking about mimicking in terms of the natural system is a savanna ecosystem. Our area had a lot of prairie on it, but there were also a lot of areas that were savanna systems near where the water resources were, where you have that multiple level, the canopy trees, and an understory. So the next step would be thinking about what functions our existing system provides, and can we replace those with some of these other alternatives. In this region, I talked about we have corn and soybean here. So the corn is grown for its high starch content. Well, there is actually a nut, chestnut, that is high in starch compared to other nuts. So it could potentially fit into those same markets and same needs. Likewise with soybeans, soybean is grown for its high oil content, but a nut like hazelnut has very high oil and could provide some of those same benefits. And as we're looking at this, we need to look beyond just the production aspect, but also thinking about the other ecosystem services, which aren't always given value now, but we're hoping that in the future there's some value for growers to be gained from the carbon that they sequester, from cycling nutrients, from improving water quality, or on the other hand, and having regulations on things that impact water quality, so that there would be just more incentive for people to look at different types of systems. And we're thinking about looking at marginal lands, those that aren't as productive for corn and soybeans, as maybe the areas for early transition, for farmers to first try some of these concepts. So we set up a very large-scale, long-term study to start to look at this and have treatments that vary in their levels of plant diversity. The control one would be the annual row crop system of the corn-soybean rotation. Then we also have a monoculture orchard, then various alternating tree crops, and adding different levels all the way up to a very diverse native polyculture system that has a range of different species. I'll show you how this is laid out. So this shows the entire trial, and to give you a sense of scale, I put the plot size in there, that it's about 1/2 hectare for each one of those plots. And if you look at the bottom left of that image, you can see one of the buildings there, and the vehicles are those tiny little items that are located next to the building, so you can get a sense of the scale of the trial. There are 7 different treatments. Again, it's increasing the level of diversity, and each one of those treatments is replicated 4 times. And the numbers on the trial itself show the treatments and where those are located. If we zoom in, you can see a little bit better what's going on. There's a treatment 1 that's the corn-soybean rotation. Then treatment 2 has each one of our main species grown as just a monoculture, as it would in an orchard type setting, so chestnut, hazelnut, apple, and currant. And then with starting with treatment 3, we have these alternating rows of chestnut and hazelnut. In treatment 4, we add currants in between the chestnuts and hazelnuts, and all the way up to treatment 7, again, which is a very highly diverse treatment that has only species that are native to this region. Looking at that treatment 4, which is kind of a mid-level of diversity and pretty practical alternative for a commercial production system, we're thinking about, how does this work over time? What's the succession pattern of what's happening here? So the first thing we're interested in is the productivity of the system, what kind of yield it has. And if we're considering corn as being our control, then we can make a comparison there. So over time, some of the tree species that we plant aren't going to be productive in terms of providing nuts in the early years, but we have a forage grown in between the rows that can be harvested for hay. The currants will become productive in early years, but they may taper off then as the area becomes shaded, and ultimately it's probably going to be dominated by the production of hazelnut and chestnut. This treatment just shows that treatment 7 alternative, the level of diversity in there. It's the same type of pattern where you have the overstory trees, the understory trees, and then shrubs, kind of a hedge of shrubs grown in between the trees but within the rows, and the diverse types of species that we have, again, these all being native to our region but rarely grown. Most of these species are not grown in our region, even though they would have grown naturally here. And to kind of think of it conceptually, looking at this this diagram, if you look at the productivity on the left-hand side, basically the yield, compared to the resilience or the ecological complexity, we're looking at, so an annual cropping system would be very high on the productivity end, but very low on the complexity or resilience end. A forest, on the other hand, is extremely complex, but productivity in terms of humanly consumable foods that yield something, it's going to be low. What we're trying to do with production agroforestry is get off of that transect of these existing options, and it probably will be a system that's not as high in terms of yield as an annual cropping system, certainly not as high in ecological complexity as the forest, but you gain some of the benefits of each. So thinking about how we assess the performance of these types of systems, we can look at the yields or the end products and the market values of those. Culturally, socioeconomics are going to be important. A wide range of regulating functions are being studied, looking at nutrient use efficiency, retention of nutrients, water use efficiency and retention, erosion control, the carbon that's sequestered by the trees themselves and by the improvement in the soil, the diversity that's conserved on the environment, and looking at the environmental impact overall through a life cycle assessment. But one thing that we've overlooked a little bit is that when we're thinking about performance, we're missing something related to how these systems contribute to a healthy human. If we look at only the production in terms of yield or how many calories are produced, then certainly the field corn system is going to rate high on that level. But that crop isn't humanly consumable. That corn is designed for livestock consumption, not for human consumption at all. Or it goes into high fructose corn syrup or other processed foods. In reality, it's not contributing to the human diet very directly, and it's certainly not covering the whole range of expected items that we would like to have as healthy humans, with fruits, grains, vegetables, protein, dairy. So instead, can we think about studying these systems, considering what their performance is in actually addressing the human diet and a healthy human diet, and thinking about the resilience of the food system, how those pieces connect. And we're thinking about this even more now that we're responding to a pandemic for the human health aspect and the local food component. One thing that we found out for sure is that that the human diet impacts our health to a great extent. If we look at the comorbidities with COVID-19, a lot of them are they're all really related to things that are connected to our diet, like diabetes and heart disease. So, thinking about that human diet, what we can do to modify that for a healthier human that can respond better in this type of situation where you're faced with a pandemic. Certain foods even can directly address immunity, and we see that some foods can help with a disease response and even coping mechanisms, and then locally grown options that offer nutrient-dense alternatives for people in a case where maybe the food system is disrupted. Here in Missouri, one example we look at is elderberry, Sambucus species. It's native to this region, and it has actually shown potential to reduce a virus directly. It's a coronavirus that's been tested on, not specific to COVID-19 because there's still a lot of work to be done there, but a coronavirus similar research has been done to show that consumption of elderberry can reduce the infected cells and show an overall reduction in the virus. And this shows how that works in that those bioactive compounds that are found in elderberry actually inhibit the virus. They basically attach onto the virus so that it can't attack the host cell and can't infect the host cell. So again, we don't know that this works exactly with COVID-19, but the fact that there's research out there showing a similar coronavirus is very encouraging. Black walnut is another one that we're very interested in. That's a very common tree in Missouri forests already. People actually just go out into existing forests and collect nuts, and those are gathered and taken to a facility for cracking and then going into the market. Walnuts in particular are known for their heart health, even more than a lot of other nuts. So they exert this protective effect on coronary heart disease, which again is one of the comorbidities. So reducing the incidence, reducing stroke incidence, and it's something very unique in the richness in the polyunsaturated fatty acids. So these health promoting compounds exist naturally, but they can also be improved by work with breeders, by selecting and breeding specifically for the components that are beneficial for human health. So the other aspect of thinking about our current situation with the pandemic is that we've just in our food system. And these can occur at various stages throughout the entire chain of our food system. And some of these were somewhat unpredictable, that I don't think people who even were thinking in advance about pandemics considered some of the aspects of how it would impact the food system. So one of the first things is that the incomes of individuals are reduced or even lost in some cases. So people have less money to be able to make food purchases. Another big thing that we saw was that the processing facilities, particularly for meat here in the United States, dealt with major closures because of the spread of COVID. So there were periods of time during the early parts of the pandemic where there was a lack of access to meat, and the processing facilities were the largest ones actually in the United States were shut down for periods of time. Another item that we deal with is that our farmer population is aging. They're an older population. I think probably the average age of a farmer in the Midwest U.S. is about 60 years old. So, we know that age is one of the factors that's impacted by the disease. So you can imagine that even just getting the crop into the ground can become an issue. There were issues with access to the inputs, like getting seed, getting fertilizer, etc. There were trade and import restrictions. So all of these pieces played into showing just how our system just isn't very resilient to these types of disruptions. So if we think about agroforestry and these specialty crops that can be grown in these, I gave you the example of elderberry and black walnut, but there are a wide range of species. And oftentimes that can be shelf stable, and they can be nutrient rich foods. And if people even in urban or in rural areas were producing these, they could have these items just available in their pantries for these times when we might deal with disruptions. So like with the example of elderberry, we see the potential for freeze drying that stabilizes those nutrients and allows the item to last for about 2 to 5 years. Walnuts are already pretty shelf stable, and they can be stored in an airtight container. These extracted oils and juices are very shelf stable and can be stocked and stored. So it's a real opportunity for rural communities who are worried about having access to food to be thinking in the future about systems where they're growing food that they can actually eat instead of growing food that must be sent off to processors. So it's basically thinking, can this production agroforestry offer this transformative solution that really starts to heal our food system and allowing this situation we're facing with the pandemic to engage people in this question. So a lot of these materials I've covered in various different publications. I've put some references here for further reading, and I can share this list with anyone who's interested in. I won't leave it up here now. But with that, I'll just kind of open it up to questions to the group. And I've put also our Center for Agroforestry website here. We're working on a new website, which we're hoping to launch very, very soon. But the existing one does have a lot of content if you're interested in the different types of agroforestry and specialty crop systems.
Thank you very much for your great presentation. We're right now ready for questions. Please write down your questions, or if you want to ask the questions orally, please raise your hand. I will activate your microphone and you can ask your question in person.
So thank you so much for the presentation. It was great. I have a question here. Am I right in that the future agriculture is a kind of designed and fully planned agriculture, and this is the end of traditional agriculture? Or is this true just in the context of United States? For example, in other countries, some developing countries that they are dominated by traditional, local, or indigenous agriculture. Is it possible for them to develop such kind of agriculture? Is it feasible for them?
Yeah, so I didn't hear all of the question, but I think what you're asking, so what I've talked about today is kind of thinking about the transformation of the system in the very industrialized part of, particularly in the temperate zone, and thinking about alternatives that deal with a much more diverse system than these monoculture cropping systems. There's certainly areas around the world where some of the agricultural systems are they're very much designed like this, like home gardens in Central America they're basically a form of agroforestry. So in a way, we're like looking to those as for inspiration, I guess, for what we could do to redesign our more industrial types of systems. And using the concepts of, dealing with climate change, climate resilience, the limitations to our natural resources, food insecurity, using those big kind of complex challenges as the reasons why we should be considering this type of transformation. I'm wondering, I guess I have a question for the audience out there, wondering, those of you who are landscape architects or who work in landscape planning, are you working in agricultural landscapes? And if so, along this line or in some other way are you engaging in those spaces?
I have a background in landscape architecture and environmental design, and I'm currently based in College of Agriculture and Natural Resources, but unfortunately I do have no experience in terms of working with agricultural landscapes and designing and planning them. It's a wonderful field of research, and probably this is what we really need as well, just to solve some of the problems in our rural societies or in the farmland. I read a few papers written by you, and this is something that I'm really going to build on it and work on it in future. But unfortunately, as far as I know, there is no background in these areas in Iran. Not yet.
Okay. I mean, it's true in the U.S. too that you know, I was in that landscape architecture program after I had a full career in agronomy, and I was the only person in landscape architecture who had any sort of connection with agriculture. And so you're not alone in not having both aspects, but I think creating multidisciplinary teams can be very useful. And I feel like the skills that landscape architects have for thinking in systems and being able to graphically represent the alternatives, they can be kind of the leaders in developing the teams that are going to be working on in these applications. And hopefully you would find some, you know, some agronomists or people working in agriculture, other land uses who think like you do and would be really interested in starting to explore these transformative solutions.
And I would like to inform you that recently the Working Group on Agriculture and Landscape has launched at the International Federation of Landscape Architects. Just started works recently, and they have kind of defined 3 lines of work for connecting agriculture to landscape, including urban agriculture, agricultural heritage, and the topic that you just presented, multifunctional agriculture. Is the most important
excellent.
part.
Excellent.
The other thing is that I'm seeing some professors from other universities and faculties. I just want to acknowledge their presence. Dr. Mohsen Kafi, Dr. Khalil-Nejad, and Dr. Haydari, especially Dr. Kafi, who is my professor, and I really owe him a lot. And I hope that in future we can work on this topic as well. And there is a question about the scale of this intervention from Dr. Khalil-Nejad saying, would it be applicable that agroecology principles be applied at site scale? Because most of your presentation were about large scale and large scale projects. I think that he's asking about the smaller scale projects, probably in urban areas as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Site scale is a great application, especially in urban areas, but also it's really the first step even in rural areas. And I focus on what I called whole farm planning, which is like looking at an individual landowner, and they have parcels of land that are located in different regions, but they're the one, or in different, you know, parts of the region, but they're the ones that are making the decision on what's going to happen. So looking at that site scale, and even in the rural area, focusing on the area of the fields that are connected with the household. Like, we found that farmers tend to manage those areas that are connected to their own homestead, their own household, differently than they manage some of the outlying fields, and that they're more open. They themselves feel some of the externalities, like they feel the herbicide drift problems or water quality problems. It's their own water quality. So there are opportunities there. And yes, to the urban setting, urban agriculture is one area where I've applied this a lot, where it is, you want to think about the broader landscape context and see how the site fits into that, but ultimately you're designing at the site scale. Very important, yeah.
Mr. or Mrs. Dale Barber, your microphone is activated right now if you want to ask a question.
Yeah, Sarah, I've got a question for you. What is the turnaround? Can you hear me?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Hello, can you? Yeah, what is the turnaround time, say taking something from a monoculture through to a functioning mixed culture?
That's a good question. So to get to a fully functioning polyculture system, we're probably talking about maybe 10 years for the trees to mature to the point that they're producing, especially the nut trees, take some time to develop. But literally, we can take a field that's in corn and soybeans right now, and we can pretty much decide we're just going to start planting trees into that. And as long as they haven't applied a herbicide or something that has residual that would impact the trees, there's no reason we can't just start planting things. So we would put the trees, seedling trees, into the ground, and then you can also plant in between the tree rows, and that can be any sort of annual or perennial system. It could be the hay crop, the pasture crop, or it could just be whatever crop was in there originally. The berries, the shrubs, berry shrubs, those are usually productive within about 3 or 4 years, at least here. So you're starting to get some value back even in 3 to 4 years from some high value berry crops like black currants or elderberry or aronia.
So our
Okay,
time
great,
is
thanks.
finished. Our time is finished. I personally do not have much to do, but I know that you're in working hours. But is it okay to ask a couple of more questions?
Yeah, that's fine. Mm-hmm.
So there are 2 other questions. One is about the question. I read out the question. Do you have you done any comparison in terms of annual culture and agroforestry respecting the potential of being infected by diseases?
So we do look at disease incidence, and I assume you're talking about disease to each one of those crops. We do look at disease incidence in those systems, but the weird thing is the diseases for the annual crops are very different than the diseases for the tree crops. So each one of those tree crops has a specific disease that it's impacted by. And, you know, we haven't done a lot in terms of like comparing, and this would be the most useful, is comparing a monoculture orchard of, say, apple or something, looking at apple as a monoculture versus apple as a polyculture to see if that same apple, how it's impacted by disease and insects. So there's more work that's been done on insects and understanding both pollinators is one from the diversity, and we do tend to get more diversity of pollinators, but also pest insects that are causing damage to trees. That's a good question, though, and more work is definitely needed in that area. See if there are any more questions. I see one about the affordability, the economic aspects, and that's a critical piece of the puzzle, because if it's not profitable, none of the growers are going to do it. One of the huge challenges that we face is that we're not on a fair playing field here in the U.S., that conventional agriculture like corn and soybeans are subsidized by the government. So those farmers for those specific crops are receiving subsidies that help make them as profitable as they are. So it is hard to compete when we don't have those same subsidies for some of these other crops. Where people are profitable is where they get into the higher value crops and do some of the value added aspects, like actually creating the juices or doing the freeze drying so that the items are then available to the consumers at a higher price. But again, it's so hard to compete right now. And also, farmers aren't being taxed in any way for any environmental damage. They're rarely regulated in any way for impacts on water quality or anything like that. So if that were to change, or if there were credits for carbon that's sequestered from trees and shrubs, that would add into the economic message that gets out there. So we're kind of like, we're ahead of where the economics are balancing out, but looking at, you know, a future in which maybe we at least try to create that fair playing field.
Another question is about the issue of ownership. Do you face any issues around ownership of the land by different people? What we have to encounter a lot in the Middle East and in Iran.
Yeah. So here, almost all land is privately owned. Some of it is privately owned. Yeah, so private land ownership is a huge challenge. And sometimes corporations own some of the land, and so that can make things tricky as well. Definitely, you know, something that we deal with. And the fact that all of these individual landowners, it's hard to get anything that's kind of comprehensive across a whole region. If that makes sense. I see a question about tourism, and tourism isn't, agritourism here in the Midwest isn't a big thing just because there's not a lot to see currently. But I think if there were more agroforestry, and in the case of urban agriculture where there is something more diverse and interesting, and if the sites were designed so that they had components that were interesting to view, more diverse, then I think there is potential for more agritourism in the area.
Thank you so much. And I think we need to wrap up our session. Thank you very much for your presentation. Thank you very much
I just wanted to say much for the invitation. Great to talk to an audience like this, and I thank all of you who participate. That's a nice number of participants, and glad you were able to join. All right. Okay. Bye. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and looking forward to seeing you sometime, someday, somewhere. Bye for now. خیلی ممنون از دوستانی که تشریف بردن، از اساتید محترمی که لطف کردن و حضور داشتن. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending this session. I just want to add something to the very end, which is what is going to happen next. I'm going to add a few words in Persian and then in English about our next session. خیلی ممنون از اساتید محترمی که تشریف آوردن. خیلی ممنون از آقای دکتر کافی که لطف کردن تشریف آوردن. من الان اسمشون رو دیدم. خیلی متشکرم که لطف کردن و حضور داشتن. از اساتید دیگه آقای دکتر حیدری، آقای دکتر خلیل نژاد، از سرکار خانم دکتر بهبهانی، از همه اساتید دیگه‌ای که من اسمشون رو شاید نبینم اینجا تشکر میکنم. در انتها از حضور و همراهی همه شرکت کننده های محترم و مجریان برگزاری مراسم تشکر میکنم. از آقای مهندس پرهیزی راد که بیشترین زحمت رو کشیدن و در واقع مؤسس این پلتفرم هستن. از سرکار خانم دکتر جمالی به خاطر اینکه خیلی لطف کردن و موارد رو به دقت فراوان پیگیری کردن. الان در برگزاری جلسه حضور خیلی موثری داشتن. هفته آینده ما آقای دکتر کارلوس جانکیویچ رئیس کارگروه منظر کشاورزی فدراسیون بین‌المللی معماران منظر رو خواهیم داشت که از ارتباط کشاورزی و معماری منظر صحبت میکنم. بعد جناب آقای دکتر پرویز کوافکن بنیانگذار و رئیس بنیاد میراث کشاورزی جهانی درباره حفاظت پویای میراث کشاورزی سخنرانی میکنن. ما به شدت علاقه‌مند هستیم که همه دوستان رو جلسه آینده هم ببینیم و انشالله تعدادمون هم بیشتر هم بشه. Thank you very much for attending the first day of live webinar series. Next week on the second day of agricultural landscape package of the webinar, Dr. Carlos Yankiewicz, the chair of the International Federation of Landscape Architects, IFLA Working Group on Agriculture and Landscape, will talk about agriculture and landscape architecture. And Dr. Parviz Guafgan, the founder and president of the World Heritage World Agricultural Heritage Foundation to give a lecture on agricultural heritage. We are very much looking forward to see you all next week, and probably more people are going to join us as well. Thank you very much, and see you next week.